I take
Yes,
that
I will.
as yes. Okay, great. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Jeneen Fields from our own here at Purdue. She joined Purdue University from the Bayer Crop Sciences, where she was a field and molecular soybean breeder, working on research for novel trait improvement and disease resistance. She is the recipient of 2 national breeding awards and a collaborator on several global projects. She's an alumnus of Penn State University and Alabama A&M University. She earned her doctorate degree in plant breeding and genetics from the University of Tennessee and is believed to be the first African-American woman in the nation to receive a PhD in the area of plant breeding and genetics, which is awesome. Dr. Fields is a clinical assistant professor, I would just say assistant professor in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology at Purdue University. She instructs the largest foundational plant science course in the department, taught each semester, and co-leads a study abroad course, which she's about to do, to Peru. Students partner with local farmers and students to execute a service learning with producers. Students also have the opportunity to explore plant habitats, and she's promised to take me next time, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Her new research program focuses on student engagement in plant sciences and cultural competency to create a global, stronger global community. And she's going to be sharing the direction of her research. And I should mention, I looked her up today. She's also an alumnus of the Walter Middlesaw High School of Agricultural Sciences. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
That sounds like such an amazing public school.
So, it was. Yeah. It has everything to do with me being in agriculture and my success in this area.
Very cool. Okay. All right. With that, I'll let her go ahead and shut up.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you the direction of our SOTO research in the Department of Plant Sciences. So we're really going to take a moment and just really look at how we can build a stronger plant science unit through instruction and research. Okay, so as we look at the different parts of this, we'll look a little bit at history and then the value of instruction, and then how this research really will be able to have an impact on student learning in our department. We're going to look a little bit at the research methods that are often utilized in SOTO research. And then I'm going to take you on just a little bit of exploration of some of the work we've begun to do in Botany 110. And then also we'll talk a little bit about how we plan to frame the research for Botany 431, that entire series, which is the Peru study abroad experience. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the research and why this learning is important to all of us. So we define the scholarship of teaching and learning. A lot of people have some perspective of what it is, but others have no idea at all. And so I always like to kind of lay out a foundation. And so when we talk about the scholarship of teaching and learning, it is a branch of academic research that really looks at how it is that students learn effectively in our classrooms. It looks at how we instruct as professors, how the environment is set up in order to optimize learning, and then looks at different techniques that can be utilized in order to, number one, expand student learning, and then also help to frame a way that students can retain knowledge. One of the things I often share with my students is that, you know, at some point you're going to graduate from this institution. And oftentimes, whether it is that you desire to run your own business, desire to go work for a company, or desire to go on in academia, you are being called upon to have a certain level of expertise in a specific area. So it's important to retain that information that you learn. But in addition to that, it is also important to retain certain bits and pieces of information just so that you can be an intelligent and kind of global citizen. So we talk a little bit about how we do that in SOTO. The final part is to look at how experiences that students have academically really have an impact on their overall academic performance and also their personal development. So to give a brief history of SOTO, it's a relatively new science when we look at general sciences overall. But one of the main things that SOTO does is it seeks to help people understand how teaching and research go hand in hand and really frame it such that it's not one versus the other. Oftentimes, as professors, we have a lot of weight on us as far as what we have to do. We have our teaching responsibilities, some have extension responsibilities. All of us to some degree absolutely have research responsibilities, but oftentimes that teaching component becomes sort of behind or falls out to the wayside because we have so many other things that are pulling on us to make sure that we're making success and being promoted through our process. But one of the things that SOTO seeks to do is, number one, to frame things again so we understand that all of the areas are important, and then also elevate it such that the universities pay attention to these different areas. So when Ernest Boyle, who is sort of kind of the father of SOTO research, looked at how we do our work as the professorate, one of the things that he did was he was able to distinguish 4 specific areas. And those areas were the scholarship of discovery, the scholarship of teaching, the scholarship of application, and the scholarship of integration. So what does that actually mean? So of course, we know the scholarship of discovery is normally the general research we're familiar with when we're looking at specific plants or trying to figure out, in, like, for instance, in my area, how different quality traits are manipulated in order to enhance certain plant varieties. That would be an example of the scholarship of discovery. When we look at the scholarship of teaching, the scholarship of teaching really looks at how it is that our students learn, how it is that we instruct, and how are our students really carrying information from our courses and integrating it into their life and professional career ultimately. When we look at the scholarship of application, that's more so how we are able to apply different components of theory and then putting those things into practice. And then finally, the scholarship of integration is looking at how we take different areas of knowledge and integrate student learning. So, for instance, one of the things I saw in my email earlier was, a grant that is trying to bring agriculture and engineering together. So that's integrating different areas of knowledge. And so as professors, we're somewhat responsible for trying to look at and cover all of these different areas. And so that's kind of the basic foundation of some of the history. But then in addition to that, as he framed, these different areas, he wanted to kind of lay out some of the things that we already know about research, but then clarify specifically when we look at teaching some of the ways that we can conduct research effectively. And so here, you're able to, first of all, you have to have a clear goal, adequate preparation. And so knowledge of the scholarly work that's been done, very similar again to the research that we do in plant sciences, so that it can sort of form how you're going to move forward and what you're seeking to, expand as far as knowledge. It looks at looking at how we use appropriate methods, so methods and materials. We, of course, go through the process of gathering data. And then we look at a reflective critique of our work. We evaluate it, and then ultimately it has to be publicly shared in a peer-reviewed journal. So when we look at, in general, how SOTO is going to help us in our approach to learning, some of the questions we will have to ask ourselves is, what do students know before they even begin with our course? And a lot of times we have no idea from which they begin. I know particularly, I've had students come to me that have had just extensive backgrounds in, say, for instance, understanding cells and how cells work, to I've actually had students say, I had an awful biology teacher and I really don't know these parts. So as professors, oftentimes we are so busy, we don't always take the time. And then sometimes students are even afraid to come to us, so we don't know where they start. And then we ask the question, what do they know after a course? That's important because again, I say for me, personal pride is at stake because I feel like to some degree, yes, I challenge them to make sure that they study, but I also want to make sure as a professor, I'm delivering content that is relevant, that is accurate, and really pushes them to be their best. Then we look at what are we doing to evaluate if the students are grasping concepts along the way throughout our different units that we're covering. And oftentimes, again, we may or may not be able to do that. One of the bigger questions is, do we even care that our students understand our material? So one of the things I often challenge myself and the students that I've begun to train, and I ask them questions like, if you were a novice, would you understand what you just taught? That's a big question that we have to answer. Also, is test time too late to basically determine if your students understand? And basically it is, so it's good to look at how we can do that along the way. And then finally, one of the questions is what adjustments are made if we experience consistently low performance in our courses or in a given topic. So we're going to explore how that happens, but then we're going to get into the specific ways that we do the research. So we look at how SOTO is focused. Generally, we're focused somewhat on what we call differentiated instruction. And differentiated instruction is basically a type of instruction that allows us to look at different learning styles and how students are able to take in information and then sort of give it back to us. Also, we are able to evaluate oftentimes through utilizing assessments. So this was just a really good schematic of just looking at some of the learning styles that we typically experience when we're looking at how students learn. And so the first one, of course, is visual. Utilizing this PowerPoint would be an example. Also, videos often are used in our instructional lessons. Logical would be an area where students typically follow paths of information really associated with engineering or in areas like that, but also mathematical equations and things of that nature tend to be very logical. You also have the oral part, which is really listening and auditory, how you take in information as you learn. And I happen to know that I'm an auditory learner. That's one of my primary ways of learning. So it's anytime you hear things, you generally can take information in. And then we talk about verbal. Verbal is just you being able to express back information. And that is a good way, sort of like I said this, now repeat. You're able to kind of bring the information that way. And then the next way is actually through social interaction. This is interesting because this is a really emerging area, particularly at Purdue, and it's one of the reasons why we are beginning to structure some of our courses with recitation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Of course, there are some people that enjoy solitary, just being alone to study. And so again, if you are able to determine that, you know that that's one of your learning styles. And finally, we have the physical, we call that kinesthetic, but also tactile, where when you're able to touch and move and experience things physically, it really helps in your learning process. So those are just some of the learning styles that we begin to look at as we're talking about differentiated instruction. When we look at specifically research methods, I'm going to get ready to get into how it is that we are able to gather this information through research. And so we look at the types of assessments. There are two main types of assessments. The first one is called a formative assessment. And the formative assessment is one that we're pretty familiar with. It's one where we use a variety of methods to basically gather information as we're going along in the course. So say, for instance, utilizing Hotseat, and I'm going to give you examples of this. When we actively question, you actively question students while you're in the process of your lecture. And then one of the ones that we're going to really expound on is the flipped classroom presentation, where students take in information over a period of time. And then what we do is we flip the classroom and allow them to present back to us the information that they've learned. But one of the things that a formative assessment does is it allows us to really see what student comprehension is taking place. It allows us to really see how students progressing academically when we look at a specific lesson or working through a specific unit, and also the course. And then it also helps us to identify areas where students are struggling. And so next, I'm going to just show you a slide of Hotseats. So many of you are familiar with this tool, but this is a tool that we utilize in many of our classes, and literally it's utilized while we're in class to assess how students are gathering information. So in Botany 110, what I do with this is I usually have about 2 or 3 hot seat questions during the lecture period. And I'll share a bit of the content, and then we will pause and we will do a hot seat question. What this does is it allows me to see if the students are processing and gathering the information in a correct manner. So this particular one was probably a few weeks ago. We were talking about protein synthesis, and the question focuses on, one of the steps that's not a part of protein synthesis. So we throw those knots in here or there just to make sure they're thinking. But this was a question the students answered quite well, where basically 117 of them got it right. But then we also see a few of them here that may not quite get the concept. So this allows an opportunity for you to go through and make corrections and help the students understand, okay, well, the correct answer we know is mRNA molecule is transformed into DNA. That's not a part of the process. We know that the other two, that's part of the process. We know that that's not part of it. That's the incorrect answer. We know that the other two could possibly trick the students. And so we explain to them, why those answers are wrong. And then we can go back into the lesson and continue learning. This happens to be one about artificial selection after we talked about plant breeding. And most of them got this right on point. They understood clearly the difference between monoculture, how we grow plants, artificial selection versus natural selection. So you can see there's some variance in how they answer the questions, but again, it allows you to go through the process of correcting along the way of instruction. When we look at the second type of research method, that is going to be your summative assessment. And your summative assessment is one where you ultimately are going to evaluate what your students learned after everything's said and done. So it helps you to really see what skills they've acquired, and then what did they learn across the course or across a unit. So examples of that would be when we actually give the students an exam, when they actually have larger projects that they have to perform, and then also self-evaluations and peer evaluations can be portions of summative assessments. So we'll now begin to look at how we utilize this in Botany 110. And one of the things I wanted to make sure we do in the department is kind of take you all along this journey, as it is a newer area of research for us in botany. And so some of this is just the framing of the research and some of the preliminary findings that we found, but we have a whole lot more that we're beginning to embark on, grants incoming and things of that nature. So just rather exciting, but the student learning portion is really important. When we look at Botany 110 as a course, it is the introduction of plant sciences, typically has about 210, 250 students, depending on the semester. The way the course is structured, there are 2 lectures per week on Monday and Friday. Students have lab once a week, and then the students attend a recitation, one on Thursday or on Friday. So typically I teach the recitation 3 times a week in order to break down the class to 85 or less students, but those students are situated at desks of just 6 students per table. And this really allows them to work in groups and talk through different concepts and actually work on the different, what I call discussion challenges, in order to make sure that they are understanding the information. It's definitely an active learning environment, and it's the core of our SOTO research. So as we look at it, there are just large general questions that can be asked as research questions. So I kind of threw this one up here because it's already one that we know the answer to. So the question is, student understanding can be increased through differentiated instruction. Well, we have a whole facility that's been built called WALK that is dedicated to differentiated instruction, because we already know that this is an effective way of instructing. However, there are different techniques that are constantly being developed in order to help students learn more effectively. So again, we utilize our recitation there. We have the discussion groups. And one of the things I've begun to implement in that class is just this semester is what's called the flipped classroom, and an opportunity for the students to do these presentations. So my research question beginning this portion of the research was, what is the impact of the flipped classroom presentation on students and their ability to learn in Botany 110? And then also I wanted to see how, if we integrate scientific articles, how that enhanced their learning of different concepts. So this was really kind of cool way to look at how we, of course, do our plant research, but then how we can pull different articles or have students research and find different articles and see how all the things that they're learning in classroom that actually connect to overall learning and making sure that they can process everything. And so we were kind of excited when we got the initial analysis of this back. We utilize what, of course, is a formative assessment, and that's along the way again. And then basically utilizing these surveys before and after. And then one of the things at the end of the semester, we're going to take all the test results and evaluate each unit. But this initial data is just going to show you some of the information that we learned from the surveys. What the students were asked to do was basically to give a presentation. And what they had to do the first time was basically take all of the information that they've learned in lecture, learned in lab, and then learned in the recitation. And then this would give them an opportunity to synthesize and connect all of that knowledge and then share it back with the class. We utilized a kind of theme called Feeding the World. And so what it did was it broke all of the information that we'll learn in Botany 110 into what I call 3 different units. The first one was, how do plants work? The second one was, how do people help plants be more efficient? And that has to do with a lot of our research. And then finally, what are the implications and benefits of plant evolution, et cetera? So in the first activity, the students were asked to create a diagram of a given process. So those processes could have included DNA synthesis, could have included photosynthesis and the different types of photosynthesis, et cetera. But they were asked to create a diagram. And then also the first presentation, they had to describe all the processes involved in their diagram. And then finally, they had to explain the purpose and implications of those and their relation to plants. The second presentation built on the first one, and what they had to do next was to briefly summarize the process that they began with. But they also had to find 2 pieces of relevant scientific literature that was published in the last 5 years and summarize it, then tell how it related to their plant process. This kind of lent itself to an area of study that is called systems thinking. And so without going into so much detail, what I can tell you is that there's basically 4 different levels that students can learn at. And so what the systems thinking does is it talks about how the students advance from, say, for instance, just understanding that cells are present, and they learn the cell parts. And then they begin to learn how the cell parts interact with one another. And then they start to look at entire systems. And then they start to look at the environmental impact on those systems, et cetera. So it looks at higher order thinking and how the students progress in that whole process. excuse me. And so here are some of the initial findings. We just did a simple pairwise t-test and looked at how the students performed in presentation 1, and then how they basically increased in their order of thinking as the presentation moved on to presentation 2. So what was interesting is we look at the initial level of thinking. All of them pretty much understood, say, for instance, the different cells and the functions in both presentation 1 and presentation 2. When they went on to the next level, really understanding how those different components interact with one another. Again, very similar. They understood that, did pretty good between presentation 1 and presentation 2. Moving on to the third order, really looking at how this ultimately interacts, looking at entire systems, still did very similarly. But when we incorporated the research articles and we look at how students grasped concepts overall and really understood how they interact and how the information worked in sync with research, there was a huge jump in their understanding and their ability to really comprehend the concepts that were being taught in class, because what they had to do was they actually had to read the articles and then present that information back. I have to say, as a professor, I was so impressed, and I felt like really the students were able to grasp the information in a way that was teachable. But one of the things that was also great is that this serves as an environment for them to review right before an exam, and we can actually make corrections. So even if they didn't get everything perfect, one of the things we were able to do is, okay, well, you understood most of this process, but let me show you here where you may need to make a little correction so you fully understand. And we're just excited about the overall performance and how that particular utilization of the articles really affected their ability to understand the concepts. Moving on to Botany 431, which is the international engagement to Peru. I just wanted to kind of frame the research and tell you a little bit about how we're doing it. And again, we don't have so much data from this particular component, but we will have more when we come back from Peru. So excited about how we're going to lay this research out going forward. Of course, I co-instruct this with Dr. Mark Russell. We typically have 14 to 20 students that we take. And one of the important things in this particular project is that this project is actually looking at not just student engagement, but we're looking at student cultural development through the service learning projects that they experience. So one of the things that happens in this course is that the students actually are participating in a service learning project, and they're in contact with producers that are in Peru. They're also partnering with Loma Linda University, which is the top agricultural university in Peru. And they have a student that is present there on the assignment of each of their service learning projects. So they're interacting with each other via Zoom all the way leading up to this study abroad experience. And they're talking with the partners, which some of them, the students have met on previous trips. I'll say some students have met on previous trips, not these particular students. Excuse me. So there's a relationship, but also we're building new projects. So the students will actually physically meet some of these people for the first time when we go on Saturday. Also on this trip, they're exposed to agricultural production across Peru, vegetable and fruit production, and then also there's a medicinal plant tour. With this research question, there again is an overall large question we ask: student engagement and service learning. How does this experience shift a student's cultural competency? So we're looking at the service learning project, how the students actually plan with the students at Loma Linda in Peru, and then overall what the study abroad experience does for them. when we look at the specific research methods, we're again asking, how is it that this impact and interaction with the producer and the academic associated colleagues really help them develop culturally? So in order to do this or measure this, we're actually utilizing the bevy, which I'll talk a little bit about, and then the IDI, which most of you are familiar with as of now, because we just went through the training for our department, and we will all be participating with that intercultural development inventory. And then finally, one of the other pieces of data that we are gathering information from is reflective assignments prior to the trip to Peru, during the process, and then also their post experience. So just to give you a little idea of what the bevy does, and then I also have some example data just so that you can see some of the areas that it pulls out. First of all, it is a demonstrated test that has over 20 years of validity and reliability, and it has been around for such a time that it is part of a lot of institutional profiles. How is it that these institutions do on the bevy? And then also it's often utilized because it has a pre and post measure, and it has a great ability to measure what we call high impact experiences. For example, the study abroad trip and how it actually changes a person. And then one of the interesting things is it has 17 different scales that it's measuring. So we can pull all kinds of data from this particular bevy instrument. Along with that, it shows us specifically, who the students sort of are, and then how these different interactions change as they learn and grow and interact with other people. And it comes from a very neutral perspective. So to give you an example of how it can show you differences, this is just 4 of the 17 that were kind of pulled as example data. So if you have, for instance, a university and you decide to measure, say, for instance, their gender traditionalism, which is, how do they view traditional roles of males and females, their social, cultural openness, how open people tend to be to other people from various backgrounds. Ecological resonance is just how passionate people tend to be about ecological things. And then global resonance, how engrossed a person tends to be about global issues. So it's measuring all of these, and it can measure across different groups and give you specific data. With all of that, that sort of frames the research and some of the work that we're beginning to do, but I just wanted to highlight at the end some of the benefits of SOTO, and we can talk about various other ones, but the SOTO research really provides faculty members with knowledge and skills and insights to ultimately teach more effectively. It definitely generates research questions about how students learn. And again, I ask the question of myself oftentimes, if a student was a novice, if you were a novice and you taught what you just taught, would you understand it? That's a valid question that we have to ask ourselves. And then finally, it's becoming an increasingly important area to so many universities. And so, of course, this is no different than any other university. It's very important to Purdue so much that they created that entire Center of Innovative Learning. So do know that this is an area that we'll be continually called upon to challenge ourselves and become better at, because it's important how students learn. And finally, I'm going to conclude with a few just brief resources. This is just a great article called From Minks to Pimps, and it talks about why scholarship of teaching and learning is important. And then finally, this was just a link that kind of linked back to the graphic that I showed about the different learning styles. And with that, I conclude the presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you. And we can take questions either in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or just speak up.
Hello, Dr. Fields.
Hello.
Hi. So that was a really good talk. Thank you very much. My question was about, because when you teach a 100 level course and trying to get students involved in reading the scientific literature. I was just wondering what has your experience been with students for whom that might be their first exposure to a scientific article, which is often written very differently from other things that students read, even if they are an advanced student in high school. How have you guided them through kind of that process?
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. Okay, so one of the things, first of all, the benefit is that the students have each other. So the way that the recitation is broken up is that literally the students are assigned to a group. And once they're assigned to that group, they're in the group for the entire semester. So say, for instance, if group one had a specific topic, you have 6 students that are working with one another. So it brings in that social component and that reliance component to help deal with how you manage that, article, how it's read, and ultimately how they're going to present it back. But then also, we have TAs available in lab, available in the recitation, and I'm available. So we make ourselves available if the students need help understanding the information. A lot of times, it may seem that, oh, the student may take up a lot of time, but I kid you not, oftentimes when students make an appointment to come talk to me about a concept, it really takes like about 5 minutes. I had a student come and talk to me about something she didn't understand in a research article, and it was just comparing different types of photosynthesis. And I just basically went through some of the main principles to distinguish, and immediately she understood. So I think it's a combination of, one, they have each other to rely on, and that group work helps so much. But then secondly, making yourself available to answer simple questions by email or by the students coming into your office, I think would be really one of the ways that you can make sure that they're able to navigate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have one. I wonder what you do with professors like me. So when I first came here, I thought, I'm smart. I'm really good at explaining things. I don't really need you, right? And it took me a long time to realize, yeah, I had a lot to learn, So how do you get past that kind of smart professor type who thinks they already know everything, to realize, to humble themselves enough to know, yeah, I have a lot to learn about teaching, especially in groups?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a little challenge because the thing about PhDs is we all know to some degree we have a level of intelligence. They don't give them out. So a lot of times we do think that, hey, I know this, I teach this, I got it. I can literally count on my one hand the number of professors that I would call good professors when I was an undergrad. It is one thing to understand the science. It's a whole nother thing to be able to explain it in a way that everyone does. And so I laugh sometimes because I'll give you an example. And I don't want to call out our specific seminar, but we'll say seminars. We attend seminars, or different people's seminars, different weeks, and we'll go through the process of listening to a lecture, research lecture. Well, at the end, it's always a question, are there any questions? It would beg to ask, are there no questions because you explain so well? Or are there no questions because nobody understood you? So as scientists, we have some basic understanding, but in general, all of us have very specific areas of research that we're working in. And you always have to bear in mind that people don't know what you know. So it's important, I think, at every level to lay out even a brief background or framework from which you're talking. And if you do that, most of the times you'll carry the audience with you. But if you come right out the gate talking about, the intricacies of, how this works or how that works, most people are just like, okay. And you can, if you're present, you can notice it by the glazed over eyes in the room. People didn't understand. And so the challenge is always, how do we take, we know we are clearly intelligent people, and learn how to break down the science in a way that someone can explain it back. Therefore, you know what they understood and what they didn't. What that requires is that we do throw certain tools in, like hot seat. We do have pauses in our lecture where we're not just talking, but we're talking to the students and making them talk back to us. And believe it or not, it's an easier way to instruct. But sometimes we just get up and we talk for 50 minutes and we leave. And we're not sure if anybody understood what we just talked about. So the challenge for all of us is really to look at how students are performing. If you look at the different units, Damon, you'll notice sometimes, there's some units students seem to get, and then there's certain pieces of material a whole lot of them didn't get. So oftentimes, even in my lectures, what I'll do, if I notice there's a subject matter that they're struggling with, I'll carry on with the information, but what I'll do is loop that subject matter back into the next lecture and expound on it a little more. And then I'll throw hot seat in to see if they progressed a little bit more on their understanding. But it actually requires that you care.
And Chow, you have a question, and I can't see all of your hands, so just go ahead and speak up if you have a question too.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fields, for this very interesting and informative presentation. And as someone who works in the libraries, I really appreciate that you include information literacy in the first year, the 100 level courses. Yes. So well, I have two questions. One is when you're asking students to find articles and read these articles, what approach did you use to teach them how to and where to find a research article and how to evaluate the quality of these articles? Okay. And the second question is, could you talk a little more in detail about the system thinking rubric? Mm-hmm. Like what exactly is measuring like student learning outcome and why it is important related to teaching introductory plant biology? Thanks. Okay.
So let me see if I can remember everything you said. So the first question was asking how is it that we guide them on how to actually find research articles. So one of the things that we talked briefly about was Google Scholar. Of course, there are so many different resources available to us at Purdue, but that's one of kind of the quick ones where we can, number one, help them find articles. Number two, they are able to kind of look at the scale and the quality. And I don't necessarily put a measure on like how intense the scale of what the article has to be. The main premise is that the student is able to identify our article, analyze the article as a group and present back the information and tie the relevance. So I hope that answers your first question. The second question is, I can actually go back to that slide to kind of help a little bit. But basically, when we talk about the systems thinking and rubric, this is not like a standard rubric. This has to be customized for each subject matter. So when we're looking specifically at the concepts in Botany 110, we actually customize this for Botany 110. There, are 4 levels, but there are so many different indicators that can be utilized. So one of the things is like I said, it measures sort of kind of preliminary, elementary, sort of basic thinking, and then it allows you to progress to what we call expert level thinking. And that really is the ability not just to identify parts, but to understand how those parts work together, how they work in a system, and then ultimately how they work, even interacting with the environment. So this is, again, a process of like, it's I guess this reference is here that can kind of give you the background of how system thinking works, but you literally have to go through and customize the rubric to fit your specific area of study. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And we have a comment from Sarah Allen, which I think is a good comment. She says she finds it helpful to take up hobbies or activities that are difficult or not intuitive to me. This helps me to empathize and think more like a student. And I remember, because I was just talking to a student about this, about calculus, I think. And I realized if we started that class together, I'm not confident I would do better than her in that class. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think at times, you know, again, as professors, we forget what it was like to be a student. And like one of the things I'll say, for instance, I'm dedicated to see you be successful. Now, you've got to want to be successful. But as a professor, I'm going to give you every opportunity to be successful. I tell students all the time, I don't give you grades. All I do is assess you. So if you get an A, it is because I assessed based on your performance that you earned an A. If you have an F, I assessed based on your performance, you have an F. So the students have the power. Now, what I can do as an educator, as a professor, is if you happen to have something come up and you are able to talk to me and explain to me why this happened, or if something was misunderstood, if you didn't understand something, I can explain it. If you, like I said, if you had a situation come up and literally I had a student completely email me and say, I forgot about my quiz. This kid performed all semester and did well on his quizzes, but he literally just forgot. So do I, as a professor, sit here and say, well, you have a 0? That's not assessing his learning. And basically, if that 0 goes in, the 0 is basically, okay, a measure of his irresponsibility or his forgetting. You have to think about those kinds of things. And so I don't get an accurate assessment of how he's doing if he forgot and then he came to me and admitted it, and then I don't offer another opportunity to at least recover a part of his grade. So these are the types of things we do have to think about if we really want to get even accurate data. Other questions?
I've got a million. I could go on.
Go, it's fine. It's fine.
Well, I did have another question. We asked, we have some professors that are candidates to be professors here. And one of the things we've been struggling with, what do you do with the student who's not particularly engaged, C student, say, and they're fine with that? You know, at what point do you just go, well, it's fine. You know, you're an adult, you want to get a C, go for it. Or do you push them? How do you navigate that issue of the kind of meh student?
And we all have them. But one of the things John and I do, we actually, the cool thing that Brightspace does, it actually has color to indicate how our students are doing. So at any given time, we can see where our students are performing at a C level, D, and we can tell if they just out the door. So every once in a while, we'll go in and say, okay, if a student, and it's usually like around D's, we don't bother C's just as much, but interesting enough, there's usually not a whole lot of them. There's usually like more A's and B's and then D's and F's in the course. And so if a student is struggling, we will do an intervention and say, is everything all right? Do you need help with something? Have you contacted your TA? You're welcome to come in and get clarity on a concept. We give them and offer that opportunity. But what I also will say is that I push the students from the very beginning. I set the expectations very high. I have to be here at 8:30. I expect you to be at class. Hot seat helps with that. But one of the things is, I think if you expect more, they tend to give more. And so we underestimate our power as professors to motivate them to do well. You come out the gate. Yes, the lectures are strong, the information is intense, but I'm here to help you through it. I expect you to be at class. I expect you to perform. I expect you to ask questions when you don't understand, but also is built into the lecture. I pause, and then I have them sometimes turn and do what I call elbow reviews. And they have to talk to each other about maybe 2 or 3 concepts that have just been covered. And then I walk around the classroom and ask them questions. I let them generally volunteer. And interesting enough, as you create an environment where they're used to talking and responding back, they start raising their hands. Like at the beginning of the semester, they're a bit shy, but as the semester progresses on, when I ask a question, I always have someone raise their hand to answer. So I think you often get what you give. And with the C students, sometimes you just have to tell them, hey, I'm here, I'll help, but you are earning that C. If you want to bring it to an A or B, you have to do something different. I may do that once or twice, but if a student decides they want to be a C student, you let them be. I'm not going to, pester them, but I will tell them you're underperforming your ability. Other questions?
Any other questions?
Yeah, I think Damien's question is really good. Like, what do you do when there are students they would like to get a C, and they have no problem getting that? I have that similar experience when I was TA in their student. We expect it's 100 level class, so they came in. They don't expect to get A or B. They just want to get a pass. So, and I help them too much. They even leave me feedback in my TA feedback, saying that I worked around too much, give them too much pressure, I think like that. So it makes me think, yeah, I shouldn't, like, if they decide not to engage, maybe we should, I don't know, maybe we should let them.
Yeah, I mean, you want to encourage, but
yeah.
The thing is, a famous statement that say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you do your part in helping, but I really believe that like motivation only carries a person so much. It has to be a discipline that gets them across the line. And so that's oftentimes what maybe someone doesn't have, that internal discipline to push to get that A versus, getting an 89.
Yeah.
It just drives me crazy as a student. Like, I hate 89s. Like, you might as well just give me an 85. I'd rather get, an A. We try to make, and I tell them, I call them scholars every time I email them. Dear scholars, you're here at Purdue, so you're not dumb. So I expect you to operate as a scholar. Baby them, but I'm here for them. And the cool part now is that the undergrad part seems to really be growing. It seems that so many students are interested in research now. I did a poll, I think it was last spring, and I think it was 68% of the students in the class were interested in doing plant research. So we have a great opportunity, I think, through all of our courses, depending on, again, how we teach, to draw people in, because what we do is awesome. The research, the work is important. And I think one of the main things about even plant agriculture is so many kids are underexposed. They don't even know we're here. We do our job so well that no one thinks about us. And we got to get them to start thinking about us.
Dr. Fields, may I have a follow-up question on the system thinking? I'm actually looking at this paper you cited in the presentation. And so phase 4 is more like prediction, implementation is like up there in the Bloom's taxonomy, right?
Yes.
So, and if I remember your figure correctly, without the article implementation, the first three are like similar. Right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
article really just boosted the like higher order like skills in Bloom's taxonomy. So
exactly.
one question is, do you have an explanation to that? Like why it's happening there? And the two is, I mean, prediction and implementation is kind of like asking a lot from the student. Do you think that fits the scope of a 100 level course?
I mean, I do. I think it does. The thing is, what I find is that students will stretch themselves as much as you push them or allow them. And so our students are generally going from a 100 level course to some of their next courses will be 300 level. Some of the next courses will be 400 level that very next year. So I don't necessarily hold back, okay, well, you're a freshman, so I only give you this. I'm going to stretch you as much as possible so that when you get to that next level course, the stretch is not so far. And what's interesting is, again, they tend to come up to where you kind of push them and demand them. So, but going back to your original question, you were saying that basically they were operating similarly all along, but yeah, you saw that huge jump when the research articles were implemented. And I think that literally was because it stretched them to really think about how these all work together and how not just understanding the basic concepts, but understanding the overall global kind of environmental, functional picture kind of fit together. So yeah, I believe it is within the scope of a 100 level course.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You have good questions.
Any last questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, sure.
So you mentioned something about the students doing a self-evaluation or self-assessment. What exactly is that and what does that entail?
Okay, so I believe I don't utilize self-assessment in all of the classes. So that self-assessment is actually more in the cultural, the cultural development area, but it can be utilized in any academic course. And basically what it is if you have the time, with Botany 110, the course is so large that I don't have the opportunity right now, and I haven't figured out how. I've heard that there was some software that you could actually put basic words in to assess things and it gives you a score. So I'm looking into that. But if a student is able to kind of write down, if you wrote down like, explain the 3 types of photosynthesis and identify major differences, and you allow them to just respond and answer that question, and it's just basically them looking at how they understand the information, that will be an example of a self-assessment. It could be graded or it could not be graded. Like one of the things I do in the courses, I have 2 things, either what I call individual expansion, where I give them activities that they have to do outside, though they have the option to do outside of class. And I have this other thing that I utilize called a growth sheet. So what I will do is either sometimes I will add a video and ask them to answer questions from the video, or I will have them draw out a schematic and label and even color the schematic so they can understand, like say for instance, how photosynthesis works when, the photons hit the electrons and then, the whole process with the electron transport chain, etc. If they take the time to go through that exercise and draw it out, that kind of helps them to learn a little more, Sarah. But I'm trying to remember, the self-assessment can be those types of activities where it's just them and they have to see how, they have the opportunity to draw the schematic, then they can go back and look in the book and see how they did. It has nothing to do with personally grading them per se, but it gives them an opportunity to really see how they're performing against themselves and how they're gathering the information. So I would say that while it's not a graded assignment, those growth sheets are that type of thing. But then for Peru, that study abroad process, we actually utilize and will be utilizing the self-assessments to kind of see how they felt like they grew after the study abroad experience. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about in terms of students assessing how much they've learned or how far they've come from the beginning of a class versus the end of the class.
Yeah.
Maybe having some sort of assessment towards the beginning and then having the similar or same assessment towards the end. So maybe give a better gauge as to how much they've actually retained.
Yeah, well, actually, so that's sort of, I guess you could say that's the self-assessment. We tend to call those pre and post surveys.
Gotcha.
Actually, for this botany course, I actually created a pre-assessment for them. So I asked them general questions about plant sciences and some of the information that they would learn. And they took that prior to the start of the course. So it was due by the first day of class. So that same assessment is going to be given to them at the end of the course to see how they changed. It will be part of the research data that we utilize.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess we've used up all our time. I'm sure though Jeneen would be happy
Okay.
to ask questions at another time. I'm sure you're
Yeah, I'll be
available
glad
as a
to.
resource.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for attending, and I'm here if you need me. We'll be doing all kinds of fun research, so I'll be calling on some of you to utilize even perhaps some of your courses in this process.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jeneen.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.